The city's oldest ice rink smelled like freezer burn and forgotten dreams, and Faye Ashford had decided long ago that was exactly why she loved it. Midnight marked closing time at the crystal ice beneath the shopping arcade, and Faye was doing her final sweep when her left skate betrayed her. The lace snapped with a sound like a tiny gunshot, and suddenly the world tilted backward in that horrible slow-motion way that let you know the fall was going to hurt. Her arms windmilled uselessly, her weight already committed to empty air, and she thought about how undignified it would be to crack her skull open on ice she'd been skating since childhood. Then there were hands, cool even through her jacket, catching her with such perfect balance that she didn't even sway. Strong arms held her steady, and when she tilted her head back to see who had saved her from concussion and humiliation, she found herself looking up into a face that made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with the near fall. The last skater on the rink was beautiful in a way that seemed almost unfair, all sharp, elegant bones and pale skin that looked like it had never seen sunlight. His hair fell white-silver around his face, and his eyes were such a light gray they seemed nearly colorless in the rink's fluorescent lighting. He looked like something carved from ice itself, except ice didn't radiate the kind of warmth that was currently seeping through her jacket where his hands gripped her shoulders. "Steady," he said, and his voice was low and accented with something she couldn't quite place, something old-world and formal that didn't match the modern black clothing he wore. "Are you hurt?" "No, thank you," Faye managed, and felt her cheeks heat despite the cold. "My lace snapped. I should have replaced them last week, but I kept putting it off, and now I nearly brained myself in front of the last person here, which is just perfect." She was babbling. She knew she was babbling, but something about the way he was looking at her made her nervous in a way that felt electric rather than frightening. His hands were still on her shoulders, steadying her even though she was perfectly stable now, and she could feel the coolness of his touch through 2 layers of fabric. "You work here," he said, not quite a question. His gaze had moved to her staff jacket, the reflective strips that marked her as rink security, then back to her face with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. "Night shift skate guard," Faye confirmed, "which means I'm supposed to be the one keeping people from falling and cracking their heads open, not the other way around. So thank you, really. You saved me from a workers' comp claim and a lot of embarrassment." Something flickered in his expression, almost like amusement, though his face remained mostly impassive. "I am glad I was here," he said simply, and then, as though suddenly realizing he was still holding her, he released her shoulders and stepped back with the kind of fluid grace that made Faye think of dancers or martial artists. "Will you be able to skate safely?" Faye looked down at her broken lace, then back up at him. "I'll manage. Worst case, I'll just walk it. The ice is pretty forgiving at this hour." She paused, then added, "I haven't seen you here before. Are you new to the rink?" "In a manner of speaking," he said, and there was something careful in his tone, like he was choosing his words with precision. "I have only recently discovered this place. I find it peaceful." That made sense to Faye. The crystal ice wasn't exactly a hot spot for the young and trendy. It was old and worn, tucked away beneath the shopping arcade in a space that most people forgot existed until they stumbled down the wrong staircase. But it had character. All vintage tile work and Art Deco fixtures from when the arcade had been built in the 1930s. During the day it was full of screaming children and teenagers showing off, but at night, in the last hour before closing, it became something else entirely. A pocket of cold quiet in the middle of the city, a place where time seemed to move differently. "It is peaceful," Faye agreed, "especially this late. Most people don't want to skate at 11:30 on a Wednesday." She gestured around the empty rink, the ice gleaming under lights that buzzed faintly. "You're welcome back any time, though. We're open until midnight every night except Mondays." He inclined his head in what looked like an old-fashioned bow, and Faye had the sudden wild thought that he looked like he belonged in a different century, one with formal dances and calling cards. "Thank you," he said. "I will return if that is acceptable." "More than acceptable," Faye said, and found herself smiling, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system from the near fall. "It's nice to have someone who actually appreciates the place. Most of our late-night crowd is just killing time before the last train." He looked at her for a long moment, and Faye had the strangest sensation that he was memorizing her face, cataloging every detail with an attention that should have been unsettling, but somehow wasn't. Then he said, very quietly, "I appreciate it very much," and skated toward the exit with smooth, powerful strokes that made it clear he was far more skilled than his earlier casual loops had suggested. Faye watched him go, one hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating far too fast. When he reached the gate and stepped off the ice, he turned back to look at her one more time, and even from across the rink she could feel the weight of his gaze. "Good night," he called, and the words seemed to carry more meaning than it should have. "Good night," Faye called back, and then he was gone, disappearing up the stairs toward the arcade with footsteps so quiet she couldn't hear them over the hum of the ice compressor. She stood there for several minutes after he left, her broken skate forgotten, trying to figure out why her hands were shaking. The next night, he was back. Faye saw him the moment she came on shift at 9, a tall, pale figure gliding across the ice with the kind of natural grace that made the other skaters look clumsy by comparison. He was wearing black again, all dark clothing that made his white hair stand out like a beacon, and when he caught sight of her coming through the staff entrance, he changed direction with fluid ease and headed toward the rail where she was stowing her bag. "Good evening," he said, and something in Faye's chest did a complicated flip that had nothing to do with the cold. "Hi," she managed, then cleared her throat and tried again with more professionalism. "Welcome back. I'm glad you decided to return." "You said I would be welcome," he replied, and there was something almost uncertain in his voice, like he was genuinely checking that her invitation had been sincere. "I hoped that remained true." "Absolutely true," Faye assured him, pulling on her staff jacket and zipping it up against the rink's perpetual chill. "Feel free to skate as long as you'd like. We're open for another 3 hours tonight." He nodded, but didn't immediately return to skating. Instead, he stayed at the rail, watching her with that same intense focus from the night before. "Your skate," he said after a moment. "Did you repair it?" It took Faye a second to realize what he meant, then she felt her cheeks warm. "Oh, yeah. New laces and everything. I went to the sports shop on my lunch break and bought the heavy-duty ones. No more mid-shift equipment failures for me." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "Good," he said. "I would not want you to be injured." There was something about the way he said it, with such complete sincerity, that made Faye's throat feel tight. Most people barely noticed the rink staff, too focused on their own skating or their phones to acknowledge that the guards were even human beings. But this man spoke to her like her safety actually mattered to him, and they'd only met once for maybe 5 minutes total. "I'm Faye, by the way," she said, suddenly wanting him to know her name, to have something more than just rink guard to call her. "Faye Ashford." He was quiet for a long moment, and something complicated passed through his expression. Then he said very carefully, "Phelan Constantine." And Faye had the sense that he'd given her something important, something he didn't offer lightly. "That's a beautiful name," she said honestly. "I've never heard anything like it." "It is old," Phelan said, which wasn't exactly an explanation, but somehow fit anyway. "From a different time." Before Faye could ask what he meant by that, a cluster of teenagers came barreling past too fast, and she had to step onto the ice to redirect them before they took out a small child who was wobbling near the rail. By the time she'd gotten everyone sorted and moving in a safe direction again, Phelan had returned to skating, cutting long, elegant lines across the ice with his hands clasped behind his back like some kind of Victorian gentleman taking a turn around a ballroom. But for the rest of the night, Faye was aware of exactly where he was on the ice, and several times she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Phelan came back the next night, and the night after that, and within a week, Faye had started thinking of him as a regular fixture of the late shift. He always arrived around 9 and stayed until closing, skating with that same fluid grace that made it clear he'd been doing this for far longer than a few weeks. He never spoke much, but he was always polite, always careful to stay out of the way during the busy periods when the ice was crowded, and he had developed a habit of positioning himself near wherever Faye was stationed, like he wanted to be close to her even if they weren't talking. It should have been strange, maybe even concerning, but somehow it wasn't. There was nothing creepy or demanding in the way Phelan watched her. It was more like he was giving her his attention, the way someone might tend a garden, patient and careful and deeply invested in her well-being. When a drunk patron got aggressive about the no-alcohol policy and Faye had to call security, Phelan was there before the mall cops arrived, placing himself between her and the angry man with such calm authority that the drunk had backed down immediately. When the ancient ice compressor started making concerning grinding noises halfway through her shift one night, Phelan had appeared in the maintenance corridor somehow and spent 2 hours helping her and the rink manager Jerry rig a temporary repair that would hold until they could get a technician in the morning. "How did you know how to do that?" Faye had asked, watching in amazement as Phelan's long pale fingers did something complicated with wires and coolant lines. "Are you an engineer or something?" "I've had time to learn many things," Phelan had replied, which was his typical non-answer, and Faye had decided not to push. Everyone had their secrets, and whatever Phelan's were, they didn't seem dangerous to anyone but possibly himself. 3 weeks after the night he'd caught her falling, Faye arrived at work to find a cup from the expensive coffee shop 2 blocks over, sitting on the staff counter with her name written on it in elegant script. Inside was a perfectly made cappuccino with extra foam and a double shot, exactly the way she liked it when she could afford to splurge on the good stuff. "Did someone leave this for me?" she asked Marcus, the evening guard she was relieving, and he'd shrugged. "Tall, pale guy, looks like he walked out of a Tim Burton movie. Came by around 8 and asked what time you started. I told him 9 and he said he'd bring this by before then. Seemed real specific about making sure it stayed hot for you." Faye's heart had done something complicated in her chest, and when Phelan had glided up to the rail an hour later, she'd been waiting with her hands wrapped around the still warm cup. "Thank you," she'd said, lifting the coffee in a small toast. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Phelan had replied simply, and the way he looked at her when he said it made Faye feel like the most important person in the world. "You mentioned last week that you missed good coffee on the night shift. I wish to remedy that." She had mentioned that, in passing, during one of their brief conversations while she was doing a safety check near where he was skating. The fact that he'd remembered, that he'd cared enough to do something about it, made Faye's throat feel tight with emotions she wasn't quite ready to name. After that, the coffee appeared 3 nights a week, always on the nights when Faye mentioned she was tired or had worked a double shift at her day job. Phelan never made a big deal of it, just left it where she'd find it and acted like it was the most natural thing in the world. And gradually, as the weeks passed, Faye found herself looking forward to her shifts, not because she loved skating, though she did, but because she knew Phelan would be there, a quiet, steady presence in the chaos of the rink's late-night crowd. She was falling for him, she realized one night while watching him skate lazy circles around a group of college students, falling in the way that felt inevitable and right, like recognizing something she'd been looking for without knowing she was searching. The realization should have terrified her. She barely knew him, really, beyond these nightly encounters at the rink, but instead, it settled into her chest like warmth, comfortable and certain. What she didn't know was whether Phelan felt the same way, or if she was just a curiosity to him, someone who worked at the place he liked to skate. He was kind to her, attentive in ways that made her breath catch, but he never pushed for more than these carefully boundaried interactions. Never asked for her number, never suggested meeting outside the rink, never even touched her again after that first night when he'd caught her falling. Sometimes Faye caught him watching her with an expression that looked almost hungry, but it was always gone before she could be sure, replaced by his usual calm reserve. The night everything changed started like any other late shift. Faye arrived at 9 to find Phelan already on the ice and her coffee waiting on the counter, still steaming hot despite the October cold seeping down from the arcade above. She smiled and waved at him through the barrier, and he inclined his head in that formal way of his before returning to his skating. The evening crowd was thinner than usual, just a handful of regulars and a couple on a date who were more interested in giggling against the rail than actually skating. Faye did her rounds, checked the first aid kit, and was settling in for what looked like a quiet night when Janet, the rink manager, came down the stairs with a pinched expression that meant trouble. "We need to talk," Janet said without preamble, and gestured for Faye to follow her into the tiny office behind the skate rental booth. 5 minutes later, Faye emerged feeling like she'd been punched in the stomach. The rink was being sold, Janet had explained. Some development company had bought the entire lower level of the arcade and was planning to demolish the ice and convert the space into luxury apartments. They had 3 months before the rink would close permanently, and all the staff would be let go. "I'm sorry," Janet had said, and she genuinely looked it, her eyes red-rimmed like she'd been crying. "I tried to fight it, but the arcade owners need the money, and the developers offered way more than this place brings in. The Crystal Ice has been operating at a loss for 5 years. It was only a matter of time." Faye had nodded numbly and returned to the rink floor, where everything looked exactly the same as it had 10 minutes ago, except now it was all temporary, all ending. The vintage tile work, the Art Deco fixtures, the ice that had been here since before Faye was born, all of it would be gone in 3 months, replaced by expensive apartments for people who would probably never even know a skating rink had existed here. She was standing by the rail, staring at the ice without really seeing it, when Phelan appeared beside her with that silent grace he had. He didn't say anything at first, just stood close enough that she could feel the coolness that seemed to radiate from him, a pocket of winter in the middle of the already cold rink. "Something has happened," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "You're distressed." Faye let out a shaky laugh that was dangerously close to a sob. "The rink is closing," she said, the words feeling surreal even as she spoke them. "We're being evicted. Some development company bought the space, and they're tearing it all down to build luxury apartments." Phelan went very still beside her, so motionless that if Faye hadn't been able to see his chest moving with breath, she might have thought he'd turned to ice himself. "When?" he asked, and his voice had gone cold in a way she'd never heard before, sharp with something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. 3 months, Faye said. "We've got until January, and then that's it. The Crystal Ice becomes a memory, and I lose my job, and everyone who's been coming here for years loses their place, and it's not fair, but since when is anything fair, right?" She was rambling again, words spilling out unchecked, and suddenly it was all too much. The rink closing, the job loss, the realization that she'd also be losing these nights with Phelan, because once the ice was gone, why would he keep coming around? Tears were burning behind her eyes, and she turned away, not wanting him to see her cry over something as stupid as a part-time job at an ice rink that barely paid minimum wage. But then there were cool hands on her shoulders, the same way he'd caught her that first night, and Phelan was turning her gently to face him. "Look at me," he said softly, and when Faye raised her eyes to his, she found his expression more open than she'd ever seen it, full of concern and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "This place matters to you," he said, and it still wasn't quite a question. It's been part of my life since I was 6 years old," Faye said, the words thick with unshed tears. "My dad used to bring me here every Saturday. He died when I was 12, and for years I kept coming because it was the place I felt closest to him. I learned to skate here, got my first job here, and now I spend every night here because it's the only place that feels like home. And I know that probably sounds pathetic, being this attached to a skating rink, but I can't help it. I love this place." Phelan's hands tightened on her shoulders, and something fierce passed through his expression. "It is not pathetic," he said with absolute conviction. "To love something deeply, to fight for what matters, that is never pathetic. That is what makes you extraordinary." The way he said it, with such intensity, made Faye's breath catch. "Phelan," she started, then didn't know how to finish, what to say in the face of the way he was looking at her. "I will fix this," Phelan said, and his voice had taken on a quality of command that made him sound suddenly different, powerful, in a way that seemed to fill the space around them. "I will not let them take this from you." "You can't fight a development company," Faye said, even though part of her desperately wanted to believe him. "They have money and lawyers and property rights. There's nothing anyone can do." Phelan's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, but it was cold and sharp, nothing like the gentle warmth he usually showed her. "You would be surprised," he said quietly, "what I can do when properly motivated." Before Faye could ask what he meant by that, he released her shoulders and stepped back. "What is the name of this company?" he asked. "The one that purchased the property?" I'm not sure," Faye said, thrown by the sudden question. "Janet might know. Why?" "Because I need to know who I am dealing with," Phelan replied, and then, Without another word, he glided away across the ice toward the exit, moving with purpose and speed that made it clear he was done with casual skating for the evening. Phelan, wait, Faye called after him, but he was already gone, disappearing up the stairs into the arcade above with the same uncanny silence he always had. Faye stood there feeling confused and off balance, her emotions too tangled to sort through properly. What had just happened? And why had Phelan sounded so certain he could help when there was clearly nothing to be done? She didn't get any answers that night because Phelan didn't come back before closing. But when Faye locked up at midnight and headed home through the cold October streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted, that the world had tilted on its axis in ways she didn't yet understand. Phelan didn't come to the rink the next night, or the night after that. By the third night of his absence, Faye was trying very hard not to feel hurt or worried, and failing at both. She told herself it was fine, that he didn't owe her his presence, that maybe he'd just decided to skate somewhere else for a while. But the rink felt empty without him, and she kept catching herself looking toward the entrance, hoping to see a tall, pale figure descending the stairs. On the fourth night, Janet pulled her aside again, this time with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Something very weird is happening," Janet said, and she sounded more confused than upset. "The development company called today. They said they want to renegotiate the terms of the sale." Faye's heart jumped. "What? Why?" "I don't know," Janet said, shaking her head. "They wouldn't give me details, just said that there had been some changes in their organizational structure and they needed to reassess their plans for the property. They're sending a representative to meet with me and the arcade owners tomorrow afternoon." "Does that mean the rink might not close?" Faye asked, almost afraid to hope. "I don't know what it means," Janet admitted, "but it's the first remotely positive news we've had, so I'm trying not to jinx it by getting excited." Faye went through the rest of her shift in a daze of cautious optimism, and when Phelan appeared at 11:30, stepping onto the ice like he'd never been gone, she practically flew across the rink to reach him. "Where have you been?" she demanded, not caring that she sounded desperate and worried and far too invested in someone she barely knew. "You disappeared for 4 days, and I didn't know if something had happened to you." Phelan looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her think he was pleased by her concern, though he was too controlled to show it openly. "I apologize for worrying you," he said quietly. "I had matters to attend to, but I am here now, and I would very much like to speak with you when you have time." "I have time now," Faye said immediately. The rink was nearly empty, just 2 regulars doing lazy loops at the far end, and Marcus could cover if anything came up. "What's going on?" Phelan glanced around at the open space, then gestured toward the far corner of the rink where the old wooden benches sat in shadow. "Perhaps somewhere more private," he suggested, and Faye nodded and led him over, her heart beating too fast. They sat side by side on the cold bench, close enough that Faye could feel the chill that seemed to emanate from Phelan's skin. He was quiet for several long moments, his pale hands folded in his lap, and Faye got the sense that he was choosing his words with great care. "I've not been entirely truthful with you," he said finally, and Faye's stomach dropped. "Not dishonest precisely, but not fully open either, and you deserve to know who I am, especially given what I've done." "What you've done?" Faye repeated, pieces clicking together in her mind. "Phelan, did you have something to do with the development company calling back?" He looked at her directly, his pale eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "Yes," he said simply. "I contacted them and made it clear that their purchase would not proceed as planned." "How could you possibly?" Faye started, then stopped, because she was suddenly remembering all the little details that hadn't quite made sense. The way Phelan only ever came to the rink at night, the fact that she'd never seen him in daylight, never run into him in the arcade during her day shifts, even though she'd looked. The coldness of his skin, the old-fashioned way he spoke, the uncanny silence of his movements. "Phelan, who are you?" "My full name is Phelan Constantine," he said quietly, "and until 20 years ago, I was the vampire king of this city's undercourt. The development company that purchased this property is owned by the consortium I once ruled, and they have agreed to renegotiate because I asked them to, and because they still fear what I could do if they refused." Faye stared at him, her mind trying and failing to process what he'd just said. Vampire. He'd said vampire, as in blood-drinking creatures of the night, as in things that weren't supposed to be real. Except she was looking at his too pale skin, his white hair, the stillness of him that she'd mistaken for calm rather than recognizing it as the stillness of something that didn't need to breathe the way humans did. "You're a vampire," she said, the words feeling absurd even as she spoke them, but Phelan nodded gravely. "I am," he confirmed. "I have been for nearly 400 years. And before you ask, yes, I drink blood to survive. No, I cannot go into sunlight without burning. And yes, I could kill you very easily if I wished to, which I do not." He paused, then added with careful emphasis, "I would never harm you, Faye. You are the first thing in 2 decades that has made me feel alive." Faye's mind was reeling. Vampires were real. The man she'd been falling for was a vampire. A vampire king who'd apparently decided to help her. Because why? "I don't understand," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "Why would you abdicate being a king? And why would you come to a random ice rink in the middle of nowhere?" Phelan was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "I abdicated because I grew tired of the politics, the constant power struggles, the endless violence that comes with ruling creatures who view mercy as weakness. I wanted peace, and the only way to have it was to step away. As for the rink," he turned to look at her, and his expression softened in a way that made her heart ache. "I came here because it is cold and dark and isolated, and for a long time I wanted to be alone with my thoughts. But then you fell into my arms and everything changed." "Changed how?" Faye whispered. "I fell in love with you," Phelan said simply, as though he was stating a basic fact rather than upending Faye's entire understanding of her life. "That first night when I caught you. You were so warm in my arms, so alive, and you smiled at me like I was just a person rather than a monster. And I have been coming back every night since, because being near you makes me feel human in ways I had forgotten were possible." Faye's breath had stopped somewhere in her lungs. "You love me," she said, testing the words out loud. "I do," Phelan said, "deeply and completely, though I know I have no right to. You are human and mortal, and you deserve someone who can give you a normal life with daylight and warmth and children who are not born of darkness. But I could not let them take this place from you, not when I had the power to stop it. Even if you never wish to see me again after tonight, at least I will know that you have this piece of your heart intact." He was giving her an out, Faye realized, telling her everything and then assuming she would want to run, that discovering he was a vampire would shatter whatever was growing between them. And maybe it should have. Maybe a sensible person would have been terrified, would have seen the danger in falling for something that drank blood and lived in shadow. But Faye had never been particularly sensible, and all she could think about was the way Phelan had caught her when she fell, the way he brought her coffee and fixed the compressor and stood between her and danger without being asked, the way he'd fought to save her Rink, even though it cost him something to reach back into the world he'd left behind. "I don't want to never see you again," she said, the words coming out firm despite her racing heart. "Phelan, you being a vampire doesn't change the fact that you're the kindest, most thoughtful person I've met in years. You could have told me you were an alien from Mars and I'd still—" She stopped, swallowed, then made herself finish. "I'm falling in love with you too. Have been for weeks. I just didn't know how to say it." Phelan went utterly still, and for a moment Faye thought maybe she'd broken him. Then he reached out very slowly, like he was afraid she might bolt, and took her hand in his. His skin was cool but not unpleasantly so, and his touch was gentle, reverent, like she was something precious. "You should not love me," he said quietly, but there was desperate hope in his voice. "I am dangerous and damaged, and I live in darkness." "Then we'll buy blackout curtains," Faye said, and was rewarded when Phelan let out a sound that might have been a laugh, startled and rusty like he was out of practice. "I mean it, Phelan. I don't care if you're a vampire. I care that you're you, and that you make me feel safe and seen and happy. Everything else we can figure out." "You truly mean that," Phelan said wonderingly, and Faye nodded. "I truly do," she confirmed, "though I'm going to need you to explain a lot of things, like how the whole blood-drinking thing works and whether I need to worry about you losing control and draining me dry." "You do not," Phelan said immediately. "I am old enough to have perfect control, and I would never take from you without permission. I feed from blood banks primarily, though occasionally I hunt criminals who prey on the vulnerable. It keeps me strong and means I do not have to sustain myself on innocence." That made a certain kind of sense, and Faye filed it away to think about later when her brain wasn't still trying to adjust to the reality of vampires existing. "Okay," she said. "What about the Rink? You said you contacted the consortium. Are they really going to back down?" Phelan's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "They will renegotiate, yes, but there is a complication I did not anticipate." He paused, then continued carefully. "The consortium is willing to sell the property back to the arcade owners at the original price rather than the inflated amount they offered, but only if I agree to resume a position of authority within their structure. Not as king, I will not return to that, but as an advisor, someone they can consult on matters of policy and interclan politics." "And you don't want to do that," Faye said, reading the reluctance in his voice. "I left that world for good reasons," Phelan said. "Going back, even in a limited capacity, means being drawn into conflicts and machinations I have spent 20 years trying to escape. But for you, for this place that matters to you, I will do it. I have already agreed to their terms." Faye's throat felt tight. "You shouldn't have to sacrifice your peace for my job," she said. "That's not fair to you." "It is not a sacrifice if it means you keep something you love," Phelan replied, "and perhaps having a reason to engage with that world again on my own terms will be good for me. I can advocate for better treatment of humans, push for reforms that I was too jaded to fight for before. You make me want to be better, Faye. You make me want to try." The weight of that admission settled between them, heavy and significant. Faye squeezed his hand, marveling at how right it felt to be sitting here with a vampire who loved her enough to step back into a world he'd fled. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said. "Both of us, partners." "Partners," Phelan repeated, and this time he definitely smiled, small and cautious but real. "I would like that very much." They sat there in the cold corner of the rink while the last few skaters finished their loops and headed home, hands intertwined, neither of them quite ready to let go. Faye had 1,000 more questions about vampire society, about Phelan's past, about what their future might look like, but for now, this was enough. Sitting together in the place they'd met, choosing each other, despite all the reasons they probably shouldn't. When the rink closed for the night, Phelan walked Faye up into the arcade and then out onto the street, staying close but careful not to crowd her. "May I see you home?" he asked. "I do not like the thought of you walking alone this late." "I usually take the train," Faye said, then reconsidered. "But if you're offering to walk with me, I'd like that." So they walked together through the October night, not quite touching but close enough that Faye could feel the coolness radiating from Phelan's skin. The city was quiet at this hour, just the occasional car passing and the distant sound of music from bars still open. Phelan moved beside her like a shadow, silent and watchful, and Faye realized that she felt safer with him than she had in years, knowing that nothing would dare threaten her while she was under the protection of a vampire king. When they reached her apartment building, a shabby walk-up in a neighborhood that was more affordable than safe, Phelan looked up at the facade with barely concealed concern. "You live here alone?" he asked, and there was worry in his voice. "It's not that bad," Faye said defensively, even though she'd had her own concerns about the area. "And it's what I can afford on Rink wages in my day job." Phelan was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "Would you object if I asked some of my people to watch over this building? Discreetly, not interfering with anyone's lives, just ensuring that you are safe when you sleep." Part of Faye wanted to insist she didn't need protection, that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself. But another part, the part that had seen enough true crime documentaries to know what could happen to women living alone, decided that having vampire bodyguards was probably not the worst idea. "As long as they are not creepy about it," she said, "and they're not going to hurt anyone who's just living their lives." "They will be invisible unless there is danger," Phelan promised. "You have my word." Faye nodded, then made a decision, and went up on her toes to press a quick kiss to Phelan's cool cheek. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything. For saving the rink, for telling me the truth, for being you." Phelan had frozen at the touch of her lips, and when Faye pulled back, she saw that his eyes had gone dark, pupils blown wide with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Faye," he said, her name sounding like a prayer, and then very carefully he cupped her face in his cool hands and leaned down to kiss her properly. His lips were cold but gentle, moving against hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache. He kissed her like she was precious, like he was afraid she might break or disappear, and Faye melted into it, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing harder than before, Faye felt like every nerve ending in her body was alight. "I have wanted to do that since the night we met," Phelan admitted quietly, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone. "You're so beautiful and so warm, and kissing you feels like being alive again." Faye smiled up at him, happiness bubbling up in her chest despite the strangeness of the night's revelations. "Then you should definitely do it again," she said. "Often, starting tomorrow night at the Rink." "Tomorrow night," Phelan agreed, and kissed her once more before stepping back with obvious reluctance. "Sleep well, Faye Ashford. I will see you in the evening." "See you then, Phelan Constantine," Faye said, and watched as he disappeared into the shadows between streetlights, moving with inhuman grace and speed. When she finally went inside and up to her apartment, she found herself touching her lips, still feeling the coolness of his kiss and smiling like an idiot. She was in love with a vampire king, and somehow, impossibly, everything was going to be okay. The renegotiation meetings took 2 weeks, during which Faye existed in a strange state of anxious hope. Janet kept her updated on the progress, reporting that the development consortium was indeed backing down from their original plans, but the details were complicated and involved lawyers and zoning boards and a lot of bureaucratic red tape. Phelan came to the Rink every night as promised, and they spent hours talking between her safety rounds, filling in the gaps of their respective lives. Faye learned that Phelan had been turned in 1643 by a vampire lord who had seen potential in a young scholar dying of plague in Prague, that he had spent 200 years learning to control his nature before he felt safe around humans again, that he had become king almost by accident, winning a challenge he'd entered only to defend a friend, and had spent another 100 years ruling before the weight of it had become too much. He told her about vampire politics, the complex web of clans and territories and ancient grudges that governed the undercourt. He told her about the darkness that came with immortality, the way watching everyone you loved die could hollow you out until you forgot what it meant to care about anything. "But then I found this place," he said one night while they sat together on the wooden bench, her hand in his. "And I found you. And suddenly I remembered what it felt like to want something beyond mere existence. You gave me back my hope, Faye. I cannot express how much that means to me." Faye told him about her childhood, about her father and the skating lessons, and the way the Rink had been her refuge after he died. She told him about her mother, who had remarried and moved to Florida, about working 2 jobs to make rent, about her dream of eventually running her own skating program for underprivileged kids. She told him her fears and hopes and the small mundane details of being human, and Phelan listened to all of it like she was telling him the secrets of the universe. They kissed often during those 2 weeks, learning the taste and feel of each other. Phelan was always careful with her, always controlled, but Faye could feel the desire simmering beneath his cool exterior. Sometimes when they pulled apart, she would catch him looking at her with such hunger that it made her shiver, though she was never afraid. She knew instinctively that he would never hurt her, that his control was absolute when it came to her safety. On the 15th night after Phelan's revelation, Janet called Faye into her office with tears streaming down her face. "They agreed," she said, her voice breaking on a sob. "The consortium is selling the property back to the arcade owners at cost, and there's money being donated for renovations and new equipment. The Rink is saved, Faye. We're not closing." Faye had burst into tears herself, and the two of them had hugged and cried together while Marcus took over the floor. When Faye finally composed herself enough to go back to work, she found Phelan waiting at the rail with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "You did it," she said, skating over to him. "Phelan, you actually did it. The Rink is saved." "We did it," Phelan corrected gently. "Your love for this place is what motivated me to act. This victory belongs to both of us." Faye wanted to kiss him senseless, but they were in public and she was technically on duty, so she settled for squeezing his hand tightly and promising, "After we close tonight, I want to take you somewhere. Will you come with me?" "Anywhere," Phelan said simply, and the devotion in his voice made her heart flutter. At midnight, after the last skater had left and the gates were locked, Faye led Phelan up through the silent arcade to the roof access that technically wasn't supposed to be used by anyone except maintenance. The October night was cold and clear, and from up here they could see the whole city spreading out in lights below them. "This is where I come when I need to think," Faye said, leading him to the edge where a low wall provided some safety from the drop. "It's the only place I feel like I can breathe sometimes, like the world gets small enough to manage." Phelan stood beside her, his pale hair stirring in the wind. "It is beautiful," he said, though he was looking at her rather than the city. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Faye turned to face him, her heart pounding. "I want to share more than just this," she said. "Phelan, I know we've only known each other for a few months, and I know there are complications with you being a vampire and me being human, but I don't care. I want to be with you properly. I want to try building something real." "I want that as well," Phelan said, and there was such naked longing in his voice that it made Faye ache. "But you must understand what you would be choosing. I cannot give you daylight dates or beach vacations. I cannot give you children born from my blood, though I would help you raise any you chose to have through other means. I will watch you age while I remain unchanged, and one day I will have to watch you die unless you choose to become like me, which is a decision that should never be made lightly." "I know all of that," Faye said, "and I'm not saying I have all the answers right now, but I know that I love you, and I know that whatever challenges we face, I want to face them together. We'll figure out the details as we go." Phelan pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. "Then we will figure it out together," he murmured against her hair. "You and I, partners in all things. I will give you everything I have, Faye Ashford. My protection, my resources, my heart, all of it is yours." They stood there on the roof while the city glowed below them, two impossible people choosing each other despite every reason they shouldn't. And when Phelan finally kissed her again, deep and searching and full of promise, Faye knew with absolute certainty that this was right, that whatever came next, they would face it together. The months that followed were a study in building a life across the boundary between human and vampire. Phelan moved Faye into a better apartment, one in a safer neighborhood with real security and enough space for both of them, though he kept his own residence in the undercourt. For the nights when vampire business required his presence, he taught her about his world, introducing her carefully to a few trusted members of his former court and helping her understand the complex politics that governed the supernatural hidden beneath the city's surface. Faye kept working at the Rink, but now Phelan was there officially as a donor whose generous contribution had saved the space. They used some of the consortium's money to buy new skates for rental, repair the ancient compressor, and restore the vintage fixtures until the crystal ice looked like it had stepped out of the 1930s. And slowly, carefully, Faye started building the program she'd dreamed about, offering free lessons to kids from low-income families every Saturday afternoon while Phelan slept. He would join her in the evenings, though, and Faye discovered that her vampire lover was surprisingly good with children. He was patient and kind, helping the nervous ones find their balance and encouraging the bold ones to try harder tricks. The kids called him Mr. Constantine and didn't seem to notice that he was always cold and pale, or if they did, they didn't care, too focused on the fact that he could skate backward while doing complicated footwork and never seemed to get tired. "You're a natural teacher," Faye told him one night after they'd finished a session with a group of 8-year-olds who had been shrieking with laughter as Phelan played some kind of elaborate skating tag game with them. "I had forgotten how much joy children contain," Phelan replied, and there was something wistful in his voice. "When you are immortal, it becomes easy to focus only on darkness, but they remind me that there is still light in the world." As winter deepened into spring, Faye found herself settling into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Her days were her own work at the coffee shop she'd picked up shifts at, running errands, seeing friends, and her nights belonged to Phelan and the Rink. They grew closer in all the ways that mattered, learning each other's bodies and hearts with equal attention. Phelan was a considerate lover, attentive and controlled, though Faye sometimes caught glimpses of the predator beneath, when his eyes would flash dark with hunger and his fangs would descend involuntarily during their intimate moments. "Does it bother you?" he asked one night after he'd pulled away from kissing her neck, breathing hard with the effort of maintaining control. Knowing what I want when I touch you. You want to bite me, Faye said, not quite a question, and Phelan nodded tightly. To taste you? To take your blood while I take your body, he admitted. It is the deepest intimacy my kind can share with another, and I crave it with you. But I will not ask it of you, Faye. The risk. What if I want you to? Faye interrupted and watched his eyes go wide with shock. Phelan, I trust you completely. And if this is something that would bring you pleasure, something that would make you feel closer to me, then I want to try it. They discussed it at length, Phelan explaining the mechanics and risks, making sure she understood that she could change her mind at any point. And then, one warm May night in the privacy of their shared apartment, he bit her for the first time while they made love, and Faye understood why vampires considered it the ultimate intimacy. The sensation of his fangs piercing her skin was sharp but not painful, followed by a rush of pleasure so intense she cried out. And when he drank from her, she could feel his euphoria echoing through their connection, the way her blood sang through his system like fire and life. Afterward, he held her carefully while she recovered, feeding her juice and chocolate and murmuring apologies for taking too much, even though she insisted she felt fine, just floaty and satisfied. That was incredible, she said, curled against his chest. We are definitely doing that again. Phelan had laughed, the sound rich with happiness, and kissed her forehead. You are extraordinary, he said, and I am the most fortunate creature alive to have found you. Summer came and went, then another fall, and Faye realized that she had never been happier. Her skating program was thriving, with 20 regular students and a waiting list. The rink was profitable for the first time in years thanks to Phelan's business acumen and connections. And her relationship with Phelan had settled into something deep and secure, built on trust and communication and genuine love for each other's strange, wonderful selves. He still advised the Vampire Consortium occasionally, attending meetings in the undercourt and helping mediate disputes. But he always came home to her, returning before dawn to slip into their bed and pull her close. And Faye had gotten used to living nocturnally, adjusting her schedule so that she slept late and was awake for the hours when Phelan was active. On the anniversary of the night they'd met, Phelan took her back to the rink after closing and led her out onto the ice. The space was dark except for the emergency lighting, quiet and intimate, and when Faye looked at him questioningly, he took both her hands in his. A year ago tonight, you fell into my arms, he said quietly, and my entire existence changed. You gave me hope and purpose and love when I had resigned myself to merely existing. You make me want to be better, to do better, to live rather than just survive. And I know that we have challenges ahead of us, that there will be difficulties in building a life across our different natures, but I want to face all of it with you. He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small box that made Faye's heart leap into her throat. I cannot offer you a traditional human life, Phelan continued, but I can offer you my devotion, my protection, and my love for as long as you will have me. Faye Ashford, will you marry me? The ring inside the box was beautiful, an intricate vintage setting with a deep blue stone that caught the light like captured starlight. Faye looked from it to Phelan's face, seeing the vulnerability there, the fear that she might say no despite everything they'd built together. Yes, she said, the word coming out fierce and certain. Yes, of course yes, Phelan. I want to marry you and build a life with you and face whatever comes together. Always yes. The relief and joy that flooded his expression was worth every moment of uncertainty. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, because of course he'd paid attention to details like her ring size, and then kissed her with such passion that Faye forgot to breathe. They made love right there on the ice, slow and tender and full of promise, and Faye thought that she had never felt more complete. They were married 3 months later in a private ceremony at midnight, surrounded by a small group of Faye's human friends and some of Phelan's trusted vampire allies. Janet officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion, and when she pronounced them married and Phelan kissed his bride, there were tears and cheers from both sides of the unusual gathering. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were difficult conversations about whether Faye should be turned, eventually resulting in a mutual decision to wait. She wanted to experience a natural human lifespan first, and Phelan supported whatever choice she made. There were occasional conflicts with vampire politics that required Phelan's intervention, and a few tense moments when other vampires questioned why their former king had bound himself to a human. But Phelan faced all of it with quiet strength, making it clear that Faye was not a weakness, but rather his greatest source of power, and those who respected him learned to respect her as well. Faye continued to grow her skating program, eventually turning it into a full non-profit with funding from Phelan's considerable resources and grants from the city. The Crystal Ice became known as a place where any child could learn to skate regardless of their family's financial situation, and Faye felt her father's memory honored every time she laced up a pair of tiny skates on a nervous 6-year-old. 5 years into their marriage, they decided to expand their family through adoption, bringing home a 3-year-old boy named Theodore who had been in the foster system since birth. He was shy and uncertain at first, but Phelan's patient gentleness and Faye's warm enthusiasm gradually drew him out. By the time he was 5, Theodore was a confident, happy child who called them Mama and Papa and had absolutely no fear of his vampire father, much to the amusement of Phelan's court. "He asked me today if my teeth were pointy because I was part dragon," Phelan reported one evening, his tone hovering between bewilderment and delight. "When I explained that I was a vampire, he said that was even cooler and demanded that I teach him to turn into a bat." "I told him vampires can't actually do that," Faye said, laughing at the image, "but he insisted that you were just being modest." "I like his version of reality better," Phelan admitted. "Perhaps I should learn to shapeshift just to avoid disappointing him." Theodore took to skating like he'd been born for it, showing a natural grace that reminded Faye of Phelan. By the time he was 7, he was helping teach the beginner classes, demonstrating basic moves with serious concentration, while Phelan watched with unmistakable pride. And on the nights when the rink hosted family skate sessions, the three of them would glide together around the ice, Theodore between his parents with his small hands in theirs, chattering happily about his day. On one such night, nearly 8 years after Faye had first fallen into Phelan's arms, they stood together at the rail, watching Theodore wobble his way through a complicated spin sequence. The boy's determination was evident in every movement, and when he finally completed the spin without falling, he turned to them with a grin of pure triumph. "Did you see? Did you see?" Theodore called, skating over with far more speed than control. "I did it without falling even once." "We saw," Faye assured him, catching him as he crashed into the rail with typical 8-year-old enthusiasm. "That was perfect, sweetheart. You've been practicing so hard." "Papa helped me with the balance part," Theodore said, looking up at Phelan with adoration. "He showed me how to keep my center low and my core tight, just like real skaters do." "You are a real skater," Phelan said, resting a cool hand on Theodore's dark hair. "One of the best I have had the privilege to teach." Theodore beamed, then noticed something across the rink and waved enthusiastically. "There's Marcus. Can I go show him my spin, please?" "Go ahead," Faye said, "but be careful of the little kids near the south end, okay?" "I will," Theodore promised, then pushed off with more enthusiasm than technique, weaving his way through the evening crowd toward where Marcus was supervising near the rental booth. Faye watched him go with a mixture of love and amazement. "We made a pretty great kid," she said, leaning against Phelan's shoulder. "You made him great," Phelan corrected gently. "I simply provide backup and skating lessons." "You provide so much more than that," Faye disagreed. "You're an amazing father, Phelan. Patient and kind and present in ways that matter. Theodore's lucky to have you." "I am the lucky one," Phelan said quietly. "Both of you have given me a life I never imagined I could have. A family, a purpose beyond mere survival. Everything I have now, everything I am now, is because you fell into my arms one night and trusted me enough to fall in love." Faye turned to look at him properly, seeing the peaceful contentment in his expression. The haunted quality he'd carried when they first met was long gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. "I'd fall for you again in a heartbeat," she said, "every single time in every possible timeline. You're it for me, Phelan Constantine." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, 8 years of love and trust and partnership, contained in the press of cool lips against warm. Around them, the rink continued its usual chaos, children laughing, teenagers showing off, adults clinging to the rail for dear life. But in this moment, it was just the two of them and the ice where their story had begun. When they pulled apart, Theodore was skating back toward them with Marcus in tow, both of them grinning about something. The overhead lights caught on Phelan's white hair and pale skin, making him look every inch the vampire king he'd once been. But when he looked down at their son, his expression was soft with purely human love. "Let me guess," Faye said as Theodore crashed into them again. "You want to stay open late so you can practice more." "How did you know?" Theodore asked, his eyes wide with amazement at her parental psychic powers. "Because I know you," Faye said, pulling him in for a hug. "And because you're exactly like your father when it comes to dedication. Fine, 30 more minutes, but then we're going home for dinner. Deal?" "Deal," Theodore agreed, then looked at Phelan hopefully. "Will you skate with me, Papa? We could work on the double spin entry you showed me last week." "I would be honored," Phelan said gravely, and offered Theodore his hand. Faye watched them glide away together, her vampire husband and their very human son, and felt happiness settle into her chest like something solid and permanent. The crystal ice had been saved, her family was thriving, and she got to spend every night with the love of her life. It wasn't a traditional happy ending, maybe, but it was theirs, built through choice and effort and the kind of deep, abiding love that transcended the boundaries between human and vampire. The Rink's sound system kicked on as someone requested music, and suddenly the space was filled with an upbeat pop song that had Theodore giggling and attempting to spin in time with the rhythm. Phelan adjusted his skating to match their son's enthusiastic, if imperfect, movements, and Faye felt her heart swell with so much affection she thought it might burst. This was what happily ever after looked like, she realized. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and warm and full of love. A vampire king who had learned to live again, a human woman who had chosen adventure over safety, and the child they were raising together in a world that contained both darkness and light. As Marcus skated past and gave her a knowing grin, Faye smiled back and pushed off from the rail to join her family on the ice. Phelan saw her coming and held out his free hand, pulling her into their orbit so the three of them were skating together, Theodore between his parents, all of them moving in sync. "I love you both so much," Faye said, her words nearly lost under the music and the sounds of the rink, but both Phelan and Theodore heard and echoed the sentiment back to her. The crystal ice's lights gleamed off the polished surface, catching the blade marks and reflecting them back like captured stars. Somewhere in the city above, the sun had set hours ago, giving way to the night that belonged to vampires and dreamers and families, strange enough to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal. And in the cold embrace of the rink where their story had started, Faye Constantine skated with her husband and son, surrounded by the ghosts of memory and the promise of all the years still to come. It was, she thought as Phelan caught her eye and smiled, absolutely perfect. Years continued to unfold with the comfortable rhythm of a life well lived. Theodore grew into his teenage years with the same enthusiasm he'd brought to everything since childhood, though now he was helping run advanced skating classes and dreaming of competing professionally. Faye's nonprofit had expanded to 3 locations across the city, all of them funded through a combination of grants, donations, and Phelan's careful financial management of resources he'd accumulated over 4 centuries. The Vampire Consortium had stabilized under Phelan's advisory role, implementing reforms that improved relations between humans and vampires throughout the undercourt. He'd leveraged his former authority into something more constructive, building bridges instead of ruling through fear, and the result was a supernatural community that was safer and more integrated than it had been in generations. But through all of it, the crystal ice remained their anchor. Phelan still came every night, still skated those same elegant loops that had first caught Faye's attention over a decade ago. They still sat together on the old wooden bench during quiet moments, hands intertwined, talking about everything and nothing. And every year on the anniversary of the night they met, they would close the rink early and spend hours on the ice together, remembering how a broken skate lace and a vampire king's loneliness had somehow led to this beautiful, complicated life. "Do you ever regret it?" Faye asked one such anniversary night when they were lying together on the ice staring up at the ceiling far above. Giving up your solitude, taking on all the complications that come with being with me? Phelan turned his head to look at her, his pale eyes serious. Never, he said with absolute conviction. Not once in all these years have I regretted catching you when you fell. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Faye. You taught me how to live again, how to care, how to hope. Everything I have given you is a fraction of what you have given me. Faye felt tears prick at her eyes, the good kind that came from being overwhelmed with love. I'm going to get old, she said quietly, voicing the fear that sometimes surfaced late at night. My hair will go gray, my body will slow down, and you're going to stay exactly like this, young and strong and beautiful forever. You will always be beautiful to me, Phelan said fiercely. Every silver hair, every line that time carves into your face, they will be marks of a life fully lived, and I will treasure every single one. And when the time comes that you wish to join me in immortality, if you still wish it, I will turn you gladly. But if you choose to remain human until the natural end of your days, I will love you through every moment and hold you when you go. Either way, you are mine and I am yours, until the stars burn out and time itself ends. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, and Faye turned to kiss him, pouring all her love and trust into the contact. They made love there on the ice again, a tradition now, celebrating the anniversary of their beginning in the place it had happened. Afterward, lying in Phelan's arms while their breathing slowly returned to normal, Faye made a decision. I want to wait, she said quietly. I want to have a human lifetime with you first, to experience aging and all that comes with it. But when I'm old, when my body starts to really fail me, I want you to turn me. I want centuries with you, Phelan, not just decades. Then you shall have them, Phelan promised, and sealed the vow with another kiss. Time moved on as it always did. Theodore graduated high school at the top of his class and accepted a scholarship to a prestigious university with a world-class figure skating program. The tearful goodbye at the train station was softened by the knowledge that he'd be home for holidays and summers, and that they'd be at every competition cheering him on. Take care of each other, Theodore said, hugging them both fiercely. And Papa, make sure Mama doesn't work too hard at the non-profit. She has a tendency to forget to sleep when she's passionate about a project. I will ensure she rests, Phelan promised, and Faye had rolled her eyes affectionately at both of them. I'm not that bad, she protested, but neither of them believed her. With Theodore away, the house was quieter, but not empty. Faye and Phelan fell back into the rhythms they'd had before becoming parents, spending long nights at the rink and lazy mornings in bed, talking about everything under the sun. They traveled when they could, always to places where Phelan could remain in shadow, exploring night markets and moonlit beaches and cities that came alive after dark. Faye's body began to show its age as she moved through her 40s and into her 50s. Silver threaded through her dark hair, lines appeared at the corners of her eyes and mouth, and she needed reading glasses for the first time in her life. But Phelan's devotion never wavered, if anything growing stronger, as though every sign of her mortality made her more precious to him. You are aging like fine wine, he would tell her when she complained about her knees aching after long days at the rink, distinguished and graceful and more beautiful than ever. You're biased, Faye would reply, but she'd smile when she said it, warmed by his complete sincerity. Theodore came home from university with a boyfriend named James, and after the initial nervousness of the introduction, the young man was welcomed into their unusual family with open arms. He took the revelation that his boyfriend's father was a vampire with surprising equanimity, mainly because he'd apparently suspected something supernatural was going on for months. Theodore doesn't age the same way other people do, James had explained over dinner one night. He heals faster, he's stronger than he should be, and I've watched him skate for 8 hours straight without getting winded. I figured either he was part vampire or part superhero, and vampire seemed more likely. I'm not part vampire, Theodore had protested. I'm just well-trained. You're also surrounded by passive vampire magic every night, Phelan had corrected gently. It has likely strengthened you in subtle ways, not enough to make you immortal, but enough to give you certain advantages. The revelation had led to a longer conversation about vampire nature and the ways it could affect humans in close contact with them. Faye had discovered that she too had been slightly altered by years of being married to Phelan, her body stronger and more resilient than a typical human of her age. It wouldn't grant her immortality, but it meant she'd age more slowly and remain healthy longer. "I should have told you sooner," Phelan had apologized later, "but I did not wish to worry you with details you could not control." "It's fine," Faye had assured him. "Honestly, if it means more healthy years with you, I'm not complaining." When Faye turned 60, the nonprofit threw her a massive party at the original Crystal Ice location. The rink was packed with former students, their families, staff members past and present, and a surprising number of vampires from Phelan's court who had come to show respect for the human woman who had changed their former king's entire existence. Phelan gave a speech that had everyone in tears, talking about how Faye had dedicated her life to giving children the gift of skating, the same gift that had been given to her as a child. "She builds communities," he said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded rink. "She creates spaces where people can find joy and connection and themselves, and she does it with grace and determination and a love so fierce that it inspires everyone around her. I am honored to be her husband, and I am grateful every night that she chose to build this life with me." The applause was thunderous, and when Faye stood to accept the recognition, she looked out at all the faces, human and vampire, young and old, students and teachers and friends, and felt overwhelmed by the life she'd built. All of this had started because of a broken skate lace and a vampire who had caught her when she fell. Everything else had grown from that moment of connection, spreading outward like ripples on water. "Thank you," she said simply. "All of you. For being part of this dream, for believing in what we're building here, and for showing up night after night to skate and laugh and be part of something bigger than yourselves. This is what community looks like, and I'm so proud to be part of it with you." As the party continued, Theodore pulled her aside for a private moment. "I'm going to propose to James," he said quietly. "I wanted to tell you first. We're thinking about a wedding next summer, after competition season ends." Faye hugged him tightly, her heart swelling with happiness. "He's wonderful," she said, "and he's lucky to have you. Do you know if he'll want to stay human or eventually transition?" "We've talked about it," Theodore said. "He's leaning toward being turned eventually, but not for another 20 or 30 years. He wants kids first, wants to experience a full human life. Papa said he'd do it personally when the time comes. Make sure the transition is as safe as possible." "That's perfect," Faye said. "And yes, we'll absolutely help with kids whenever you're ready. Grandchildren would be amazing." The wedding the following summer was beautiful, held at sunset so that Phelan could attend without worry. They exchanged vows at the Crystal Ice, surrounded by flowers and fairy lights and more love than Faye had thought possible to contain in one space. And when Theodore and James skated their first dance as husbands, gliding together across the ice with practiced grace, Faye leaned against Phelan's shoulder and felt complete. Years continued their steady march forward. Theodore and James did have children, 2 daughters through surrogacy who called Faye and Phelan Grandma and Grandpa, and showed the same natural affinity for skating that seemed to run in the family. The nonprofit continued to expand, eventually covering 7 locations and serving hundreds of children every year. And through all of it, Faye and Phelan remained the steady center, their love deepening with time rather than fading. When Faye turned 75, her body finally started to show real signs of failing. Her knees and hips ached constantly despite the vampire magic that had kept her strong for so long. She needed a cane to get around the rink safely, and even skating her greatest joy became difficult as her balance faltered. It's time," she told Phelan one night as they sat together in their living room. "I've had my human lifetime, and it's been beautiful. But I'm ready now. I want those centuries with you that you promised. I want to skate without pain again, to travel without exhaustion. I want to be yours in all ways, including this one." Phelan looked at her for a long moment, his expression full of love and sadness and acceptance. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Once done, it cannot be undone. You will be vampire with all that entails." "I'm certain," Faye said firmly. "I've had 75 years to think about it, and this is what I want. Turn me, Phelan. Make me yours forever." They made careful preparations, consulting with vampire elders to ensure the transition would be as safe as possible. Theodore and his family were informed and given the chance to say proper goodbyes to the human version of Faye. Janet, long since retired but still involved with the non-profit, threw a small, intimate gathering of Faye's closest friends and colleagues to celebrate her life and the choice she was making. On the night of the turning, Phelan took Faye to the crystal ice one last time as a human. They skated together slowly, her hand gripping his for balance, making final loops around the ice where they'd first met over 40 years ago. "No regrets?" Phelan asked as they reached the center of the rink. "Not a single one," Faye said honestly. "You've given me an incredible life, Phelan. Now give me an incredible eternity." He pulled her close and kissed her deeply, then bared his fangs and bit down on her neck with purpose. The sensation was familiar after decades of intimate feedings, but this time he didn't stop. He drank deeply, pulling her blood into himself until her heart began to slow and darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. Just before she would have died, he opened his own wrist and pressed it to her mouth. "Drink," he commanded, and Faye obeyed. His blood was cold and rich, tasting of copper and something indefinable that sang through her system like electricity. She drank until he pulled away, and then the pain began. The transformation took 3 days, during which Faye existed in a state of agony as her body died and remade itself. Phelan stayed with her the entire time, holding her through the worst of it, murmuring reassurances and love in multiple languages. Theodore and James visited when they could, bringing the granddaughters to sit quietly near Faye's bedside. On the third night, Faye woke with a gasp. The pain was gone, replaced by a sense of overwhelming vitality. Her vision was sharper, colors more vivid. She could hear everything, the hum of electricity in the walls, conversations happening floors below, the heartbeats of humans passing on the street outside. And she felt strong, powerful, in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "Faye," Phelan said softly, appearing at her side. "How do you feel?" She turned to look at him and saw clearly for the first time in years, taking in every detail of his beautiful, beloved face. "I feel alive," she said wonderingly, then laughed at the irony. "Or undead, I suppose." "Phelan, is this how you experience the world all the time? Everything is so intense." "You will learn to modulate it," he promised, "to filter what you need and block out the rest. But yes, this is my reality. Our reality now." Faye stood carefully, marveling at how easy movement was without pain, without the limitations of an aging body. She was herself still, fundamentally the same person she'd always been, but transformed in ways that would take time to fully understand. "I want to skate," she said suddenly. "Phelan, I want to go to the rink and skate the way I used to, fast and free. Can we do that?" He smiled, bright and genuine. "We can do anything you wish," he said. "You are vampire now, my love. The world is ours to explore." They went to the crystal ice in the deepest hours of night, when the space was empty and dark. Phelan turned on just enough lights to see by, and then they skated together the way they had decades ago, before age and responsibility had slowed Faye down. She flew across the ice with speed and grace that she'd lost 30 years prior, her vampire strength and coordination making everything effortless. "This is amazing," she called to Phelan as she executed a jump she hadn't been able to do since her 20s, landing it perfectly. "I'd forgotten what this felt like." "You are magnificent," Phelan said, skating up beside her with glowing eyes. "Absolutely magnificent. I have loved you as a human, and I will love you as a vampire, and I will spend the next 1,000 years showing you all the wonders this existence can offer." They skated until dawn forced them to retreat to safety, and in the days and weeks that followed, Faye learned to navigate her new reality. The thirst for blood was manageable with Phelan's guidance, the need for sunlight protection became routine, and slowly she adapted to being vampire while still maintaining her essential self. The nonprofit transitioned to new leadership, with Faye staying on as a nighttime consultant and benefactor. Theodore took on more administrative duties, preparing to eventually take over when he was ready, and the crystal ice remained what it had always been, a community space, a place of joy, a monument to the transformative power of choosing to catch someone when they fall. 20 years after her turning, Faye and Phelan stood together at the rink watching their great-granddaughter wobble across the ice on her first pair of skates. The child, also named Faye, though she went by Faye, had the family's natural grace, but was still figuring out how to use it, her small legs shaking with effort as she tried to maintain balance. Just like her grandmother, Phelan murmured, his arm around Faye's waist, determined and fearless. Great-grandmother, Faye corrected with amusement. I'm old enough to be a great-grandmother multiple times over now, even if I don't look it. You will always be young and beautiful to me, Phelan said, which was sweet, even though they both now appeared to be the same age, frozen in their prime by vampire immortality. Little Faye managed 3 full loops around the rink before her mother, Theodore's youngest daughter, called time and lifted her off the ice. The child waved enthusiastically at Faye and Phelan as she was carried away, already begging to come back tomorrow. She has the passion, Faye said fondly. Give her a few years and she'll be teaching alongside Theodore's husband. A skating legacy, Phelan agreed, built on love and preserved through choice. Your father would be proud of what you've created here, Faye. She leaned into his embrace, feeling the familiar coolness of his touch that was no longer foreign to her own temperature. I think he would be, she said quietly. I hope he'd be proud of all of it, the nonprofit, the family, the choice to become what I needed to be to stay with you. He would understand, Phelan said with certainty. Any parent who truly loves their child wants them to be happy in whatever form that happiness takes. And you are happy, are you not? Deliriously, Faye confirmed. Every single day for over 40 years now. You kept your promise, Phelan Constantine. You caught me when I fell, and you never let me slip away. And I never will, Phelan vowed, turning her to face him so he could kiss her properly. Not in all the centuries to come. You are mine, and I am yours, forever bound by the choice we made in this rink so long ago. As they stood there in their embrace, the crystal ice hummed with life around them, children learning to skate, teenagers practicing tricks, adults rediscovering joy and movement. The vintage fixtures gleamed, the ice sparkled under lights that had been replaced countless times, but maintained their original Art Deco styling, and the whole space echoed with laughter and the sound of blades on ice. It was perfect. It was home. And it was the foundation on which an immortal love had been built, one broken skate lace and one perfectly timed rescue at a time. Faye pulled back from the kiss and took Phelan's hand, leading him toward the ice. Come on, she said with a grin that showed just the hint of fang. Let's show these youngsters how it's really done. As you wish, my love, Phelan said, and together they glided onto the ice. 2 vampires who had found their forever in the most unlikely of places, a rundown skating rink beneath a shopping arcade, where a human woman had once fallen backward into a vampire king's arms and changed both their existences irrevocably. The ice welcomed them home the way it always had, cold and smooth and eternal, the perfect metaphor for a love that had transcended mortality to become something even stronger. And as they skated together in perfect synchronization, the product of decades of practice and genuine partnership, everyone else on the rink stopped to watch and marvel at the grace and obvious devotion of the couple who seemed to embody everything beautiful about the sport. That's Mrs. Constantine and her husband, one of the teenage students whispered to her friend. They've been skating together forever. My mom says they're like the ultimate relationship goals. They're vampires, right? The friend whispered back. That's what I heard. Yeah, but like really nice ones. They founded the whole nonprofit program and they're always here helping people. Plus, have you seen the way he looks at her? It's like she's the only person in the world. The first girl sighed dreamily. I want someone to look at me like that someday. Same, her friend agreed, and they both went back to watching the Constantines glide across the ice with the kind of effortless grace that came from centuries of practice and a love that defied death itself. As the night deepened and the rink's closing time approached, Phelan and Faye made their final circuit together, hands intertwined, moving as one unit across the ice they'd claimed as their own so many years ago. The music faded, the lights dimmed, and one by one the other skaters departed, until only the 2 of them remained in the cold, familiar space. Same time tomorrow? Faye asked, echoing the question she'd posed countless times over the decades. Same time tomorrow, Phelan confirmed, and sealed the promise with a kiss. And the day after, and the day after that, for as long as the ice remains and beyond. They left together as dawn approached, two pale figures slipping into the shadows, heading home to the life they'd built through patience and love and the transformative power of catching someone when they fall. Behind them, the crystal ice settled into its daily rest, waiting to wake again come evening, eternal and unchanging and exactly where it needed to be. And in the quiet darkness, if you listened closely, you could almost hear the echo of skate blades on ice, the ghost of every perfect moment that had happened in this space, layered one atop another until they formed something that felt almost like magic. Because some love stories are written in the stars and some are carved into ice, and the ones carved into ice last just as long, preserved forever in the cold, eternal embrace of a place where two impossible souls found each other and chose forever, one night at a time.